Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible to get your free audiobook today. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Conn Hallinan about his article, A Global Nuclear Winter, Avoiding the Unthinkable in India and Pakistan. Conn is a columnist for Foreign Policy and Focus and an independent journalist. He oversaw the journalism program at the University of California at Santa Cruz for 23 years and was a college provost at UCSC. You can follow his work at dispatchesfromtheedge.wordpress.com and via his archive at Foreign Policy and Focus at fpif.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/India-Pakistan. Conn, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So I want to get started by looking at a background of the tensions between India and Pakistan. Since the article is focused on the potential for a global nuclear winter, obviously that means there are some tensions that have been in place for quite some time. So what is the background of those tensions, and what's really at the core of those tensions?
Well, it goes back to the original division of India and Pakistan in 1947, following the withdrawal of the British colonial forces. And, you know, there was a debate at that time as to whether or not there should be two separate countries. Pakistan is of course, largely Muslim, and India is largely Hindu, though there are significant populations of both people in both Pakistan and India. So in 1947, the two countries were divided, and it was a terribly traumatic thing. Large numbers of Muslims either moved on their own or were forcibly moved into Pakistan. Hindus were left or again were forced out. Nobody's quite sure how many people died, but it was probably in excess of 1 million people. And the tensions really developed because what was undecided was the Kashmir region of India and Pakistan, and that is currently now divided between India and Pakistan. India occupies some of Kashmir, and Jammu and Kashmir, and Pakistan occupies the other part. The United Nations had said that they were going to have a referendum to decide what people in Kashmir wanted to do, whether they wanted to go to India, whether they wanted to go to Pakistan, or whether they wanted to be independent. But that referendum has never been held. And so India has occupied these two sections of Kashmir. One is mostly Hindu, and the other is almost all Muslim and some Sikh. And it's been a very tense colonial occupation, and it has ignited 3 wars between Pakistan and India. There is a great deal of tension right now because there's a lot of unrest going on in Kashmir. There have been firings across the Indian-Pakistani border, and there was a recent incident in which Indian special forces crossed the Pakistani border, went about 30 kilometers into Pakistan and attacked a group of militants who had formerly attacked an Indian army base and killed 19 Indian soldiers. So you have this very tense situation going on, and almost no one knows about it. I mean, you have two nuclear armed countries that are shooting at one another, and where the leadership of both the military and political leadership of both countries are very casual in the way that they talk about using nuclear weapons. And one of my concerns, the reason I wrote this article, is because there have been two very recent developments that should be deeply concerning to anyone. I mean, let alone Indians and Pakistanis, but anyone in the world for that matter. And that is that the Pakistanis have developed tactical nuclear weapons, low yield, small explosion, etc., deployed them and put them under the control of frontline commanders. Now, normally, nuclear weapons, the decision to use a nuclear weapon is it's not a military decision, it's really a political decision. But the Pakistanis have basically turned over the decision as to whether to use these weapons to frontline commanders, where the Pakistani army is greatly inferior to the Indian army. And so the possibility of a frontline commander in the advent of a war with India deciding to use nuclear weapons because the Indian army is both bigger and better armed, etc., is not an abstraction. I mean, in fact, it's probably likely what would happen. At the same time, the Indians have made a policy which they call cold start, which is to, in the advent of a terrorist attack on India, and there have been several over the last decade and a half, they will have the right to invade Pakistan to a depth of some 30 or 40 kilometers. Pakistan's response to that is, we'll use nuclear weapons. Suddenly you're faced with a situation where these two countries that have in excess of 100 nuclear weapons each, the Indians have about 110, I think, and the Pakistanis have about 130, something like that, you could have a nuclear exchange. The effect of that exchange, scientists have been very carefully looking at this, would be besides the death of anywhere up to 20 million Pakistanis and Indians, it would result in huge, enormous amounts of burning cities, of oil, of essentially huge clouds that would have a worldwide effect. It would drop temperatures all over the northern hemisphere as much as 5 or 6 degrees, which would mean that significant parts of Russia and Canada would not be able to grow wheat. One of the things that nuclear weapons do is that they destroy ozone layers. So you would have a destruction of big sections of the ozone layer, which will allow ultraviolet radiation to pour on the Earth, and ultraviolet radiation causes cancer. It would be a worldwide disaster. It wouldn't just be a local, regional disaster. It would be a disaster that would affect the entire world, and particularly the Northern Hemisphere.
Sure, and I want to return to many of the topics that you just raised there. But first, let's talk about the past wars between India and Pakistan, because you mentioned that there have been a few of those, and in many cases they focused on Kashmir, on the region that you mentioned. So what did we see in those past wars between India and Pakistan? When were they? And just how dangerous did they get? How close did the world come to experiencing a global nuclear winter then?
Well, the one that I think probably came closest to it was the 1999 Kargil incident, in which Pakistani military supported Muslim militants attacked and seized a section of Kashmir. And the Indian army counterattacked. How close we got was apparently the Pakistanis were starting to load their nuclear weapons on missiles, and it was the intervention of the Clinton administration that talked them out of arming their missiles. So that's pretty close, and that's very scary. There have been two other major terrorist incidents. In 2002, there was a Pakistani militants attacked the Indian Parliament, and then the 2008 attack on Mumbai, which killed, I think, 167 people. If that were to happen today, under this new policy of cold start, the Indian army would likely cross the Pakistani border. If the Indian army crosses the Pakistani border, that might ignite a nuclear war. And there's also a difference in the way both of these countries are armed. Pakistan's nuclear weapons are all directed at India. It's not true of India. India also has tensions with both territorial tensions and political tensions with China, so that a number of its nuclear weapons are mounted on intercontinental ballistic missiles and aimed at China. India has never produced tactical nuclear weapons that we know of. So the Indians would be faced with the fact that they would be fired upon by tactical nuclear weapons, and the only response they could have was strategic nuclear weapons. And the difference between these, is that a tactical nuclear weapon would be something that was slightly smaller than, say, for instance, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945, about 15 kilotons. The strategic nuclear weapons are, 100 kilotons, 200 kilotons, 250 kilotons. They make what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like, a hand grenade. That's the problem with nuclear weapons, is that they're talked about as if they're weapons, but they're not really weapons in the sense of the world that we really think about them as a weapon. Their destructive power is simply beyond what almost anyone can imagine, which is why I think people are so casual about the way they talk about them.
Sure, and you obviously mentioned that both sides have very legitimate, I guess we could say, security concerns,
yeah.
And that there are many reasons why these security concerns could increase. Can you get into that a little bit more, and how these recent developments, the two recent developments that you highlighted earlier, tie in so closely to those very real security concerns that both India and Pakistan have?
Right, and Pakistan's concerns, security concerns, is that the Indian army is much bigger and more powerful, and it's fought 3 wars and has lost all 3 wars. So it's nervous, certainly, about India. India has also been very active in Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan, which, as you know, borders, of course, the northern border of Pakistan. And Pakistan has always viewed Afghanistan as a kind of a safety valve, that in the case of a massive attack by the Indian army, that Pakistan could retreat into Afghanistan. I mean, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is an arbitrary border. Anyhow, it was drawn in 1894 without any regard to ethnicity or religion or anything. It's just really a line on the map. Not even Afghanistan accepts it as an international border. Well, with the Indians now active in southern Afghanistan, suddenly the Pakistanis are feeling like they're between a hammer and an anvil. And that's going to make them a lot more nervous. Now, one thing you don't want to do is make people who have nuclear weapons nervous. You want to keep them calm. So the Indian actions in southern Afghanistan have really raised tensions in Pakistan. India has absolutely legitimate security concerns. As I say, if you take the Kargil incident, the attack on Parliament, the attack in Mumbai, several other recent border incidents and stuff, I mean, Indians have been legitimate victims of state-sponsored terrorism by Pakistan. So there are absolutely legitimate security concerns there either. The question is how you resolve these things. And the problem that we're in right now is that the Obama administration, when Obama was elected president back in 2008, he pledged that he was going to try and do something about Kashmir, to see if they could lower the tensions between Pakistan and India over Kashmir. But what got in the way was the Asia pivot. And what happened was the Americans decided that it would be more important to get India to join its kind of alliance to restrict China, and therefore they dropped talking about the issue of Kashmir, and they went a step further. And this is, in some ways, the most dangerous thing that was done. India and Pakistan have not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as such, because they did not sign it, they are not allowed to buy uranium on the international market. Now, that's not a problem for Pakistan. It's got a lot of native uranium. But it is a problem for India, which has very, very minor deposits of uranium, and they also have a civilian nuclear power thing. So they have to kind of decide whether they put the uranium into nuclear weapons or into power. What happened, it started under Bush, but then the Obama administration agreed with it, was that they set up something called the 123 Agreement, and it allowed India to bypass the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to buy supplies of uranium on the international market, even though they have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as long as they didn't use it for nuclear weapons. Well, that was fine with the Indians, because all they did was they took their modest supplies that they are native uranium, and they used those for their nuclear weapons, and then could buy all the uranium they wanted for their nuclear power. Pakistan said it wanted the same deal. The United States said, no, we're not going to give you the same deal. So from Pakistan's point of view, suddenly the United States and India are ganging up on it. And from China's point of view, the United States has just allowed India to build, to upgrade their nuclear weapons industry, which is large part aimed at China. So there are not just tensions between Pakistan and India. There are regional tensions, both in South Asia and in East Asia, that all of this is playing into. And one of the things that happened early on when the Bush administration started to talk about this 123 agreement with India was the Pakistanis warned that if such an agreement was signed, that it would ignite a nuclear arms race in Asia and South Asia. And that's exactly what it's done. Pakistan is in the midst of a major crash program to build nuclear weapons. They are, at this point, slated to pass Britain by the year 2030. India is on a crash program to build nuclear weapons, and apparently, this is rumor, I don't know this for certain, rumor is they're working on a thermonuclear weapon, and that is a hydrogen bomb. China is in the midst of upgrading their nuclear weapons industry and developing new delivery systems, putting multiple warheads on missiles, and North Korea is building up their nuclear weapons. So the effect, the prediction back in 2003, when this agreement was first proposed by the Bush administration, was that it would ignite a nuclear arms race, and indeed we have a wide-open nuclear arms race.
And on top of all this, focusing on India and Pakistan again in particular, as you point out in your article, there's very strong nationalist fervor in both of those countries. What are some of the ways we've seen this nationalist fervor, and how could that affect what might potentially happen?
Well, what happened when this incident recently, where the Indian soldiers 19 Indian soldiers were killed in this terrorist attack, the Indian media has just gone crazy. One of the proposals, India has a huge film industry, Bollywood, and one of the proposals is that they will not hire any Pakistani actors. They will not show Pakistani films. There are the current government in India, the Modi government, is a very nationalist and pretty right-wing government. And they are pressing movie theaters not to show Pakistani films, not to hire Pakistani actors, cancel cross-border sporting events, etc. And generally kind of just to raise a level of, kind of beat the war drums, as it were. And pretty much the same thing is going on in Pakistan, except that the Pakistanis are actually much more afraid of the Indians and vice versa, which is not a good thing, because there's no question that in a war, India could easily defeat Pakistan. But if it turned nuclear, there would really be no winners. There is no such thing as a winner in a nuclear war. And there would be no way that India could stop Pakistan from destroying some of its major urban areas. I mean, even if Pakistan were really obliterated, it would still kill tens of millions of Indians. And, of course, it would produce exactly what we're talking about here in terms of a nuclear winter. So we would feel it right here in California.
All right, I'm going to do a favor for you, and you're going to do a favor for me. Are you ready? My favor for you is telling you how to get a free audiobook. Here's how you do it. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible and sign up for one of Audible's free 30-day trials. This will allow you to get a free audiobook download from Audible that you get to keep regardless of whether you end up getting a paid subscription. You can choose from books we've covered on the show, such as The Primal Prescription by Bob Murphy and Doug McGuff, or Base Nation by David Vine. And particularly relevant for today's episode, you can choose Hiroshima by John Hersey, or you can choose from any of the over 180,000 audiobooks Audible has to offer. Your favor for me is getting your free audiobook and thus supporting the show. To download your free audiobook today, go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible to get your free, did I mention it's free, audiobook right now and to help keep the Wake Up Call podcast going. Yeah, now, before we get back to the subject of a nuclear winter, let's look a little closer at Kashmir, the region that in many ways is at the heart of these tensions that you describe in your article as the single most dangerous spot on the globe. So what exactly is the situation in Kashmir? What's it like there, and what are some of the issues and problems that we've seen crop up there and continue to exist there?
Well, a big reason for the tensions in Kashmir. Now, it's generally put in religious terms. In other words, India is largely Hindu country, and Kashmir is largely Muslim. Okay, so there are religious tensions there, but religion many times tends to be a synonym for something else, and so like Ireland. I mean, Catholics and Protestants. And Catholic and Protestants were really not fighting over the Trinity in Northern Ireland. They were fighting over access to resources, political power, etc. Kashmir has been occupied by the Indian Army since 1949, really. And the occupation is one which is pretty standard colonial occupation. In fact, it's interesting. I use the term, I mentioned Ireland. There's a law which was originally designed for Northern Ireland in 1925 called the Special Powers Act. And what the Special Powers Act does is that it allows the military authorities to arrest and incarcerate anyone they want without charges and to keep them permanently incarcerated. And it also makes military forces and police forces immune from civilian law. So what's happened in Kashmir is that over the years, there have been tens of thousands of Kashmiris. Anywhere from 50 to 80,000 people have died over the past 6 decades, and thousands of others have been disappeared by security forces. And it's this occupation. Right now, there are big demonstrations going on, and Indian forces are using birdshot. And so there's this huge rash of people losing their eyes, demonstrators losing their eyes and things. This is the tensions that develop here are the same kinds of tensions. The Israelis use the Special Powers Act in the occupied territories. The British authorities used it in Kenya. The South African authorities used it as the basis for their apartheid laws. I mean, it's one of these one-size-fits-all things that just causes tremendous tension between the security forces who feel like they're immune and occupied who hate the security forces who then feel under fire and insecure. And so it's this, it's constant tension that just goes on all the time. Right now, in the past, demonstrations or resistance to the occupation in Kashmir, many of them have been the result of what was sponsored in Pakistan, Pakistani-sponsored kinds of things. But that is not what this is. This is much more a homegrown, indigenous exhaustion with colonial occupation. I mean, the fact is that you can't occupy 12 million people for over 50 years, 60 years. It's impossible. It just can't. It can't be done. And in the long run, there has to be a way to resolve this. Now, the easiest way to resolve this, I mean, my recommendation, everybody would take it, but is to, one, stand down the Indian Army and put them back in the barracks. Get rid of, or I would say suspend, the Special Powers Act, and organize a referendum. And both sides, Pakistan and India, would have to accept the results. I don't think either side's going to be happy with the outcome, because I think the Kashmiris are going to vote for independence. And Pakistan's not going to like that. And India's not going to like that. But it's the Kashmiris' lives, and they really kind of have the right to determine what that's going to be.
Yeah, so you obviously just mentioned one potential solution there, but what solutions have we seen attempted in the past?
Not much. See, that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that India will not talk about Kashmir. They absolutely will not discuss Kashmir. If you try to have that conversation with the Indians, they will not discuss it. Pakistan, their only discussion is all of those Muslims should be part of Pakistan. So this has been, I think this has been, I'm trying to think of another historical example. And I mean, certainly the situation in with the Palestinians and the Israelis is this kind of situation, but that's only been since really 1967. This has been since 1949. So it's a much longer running situation. In fact, right now it's the longest colonial occupation on the globe, and the level to which the Indians want to discuss this sometimes get kind of comic. The Financial Times recently ran a map which showed the various areas, Kashmir and Jammu, and the disputed territories in Kashmir. And the Indians would not let them run it in an Indian newspaper. And in fact, they're passing a law now that will make it a multi-million-dollar fine if you do that, and jail time. Well, that's a level that's a little silly. I mean, imagine if you would running a map of, say, Israel with Palestinian areas that are currently occupied, and that would get you a jail sentence. I mean, that wouldn't happen in Israel, and yet the Indians have reached that level of essentially denial of talking about this, and that's the part that's hard to get by. However, India needs the United States. The United States is the most powerful force in East Asia and South Asia. It's the most powerful military force on the planet. It's also a huge market. And right now the Indians are very much need growth. They have a real problem with lifting a big section of the population out of poverty. And also desperately needed infrastructure. The United States is critical to that. So it's not like the United States doesn't have some bargaining power here. It's just the question of whether we're willing to use it. And at this point, we're not, because we see India as an important ally in any potential conflict in the future with China.
Yeah, and so you say that the U.S. has bargaining power that is opted not to use, but earlier you did mention a situation where the Clinton administration got involved in the tensions between India and Pakistan. What other ways have we seen the U.S. get involved in the past, and what has the U.S.'s role, and what have the roles of other countries from outside of that region been thus far?
Well, besides the Clinton administration's I mean, you'd have to go way back. I don't know. You could go way back to the Nixon administration, where at one point there was what they call a Pakistani tilt, And Henry Kissinger decided that he was going to pressure the Indians to get out of their kind of neutrality position, because India's always had a neutral foreign policy. They were one of the founders of the non-alignment movement in the late 50s and early 60s. That included, countries like Indonesia and most of the countries in Africa, etc. And the United States decided it was going to tilt toward Pakistan, give them aid, military weapons, etc., as a way to pressure the Indians to back away from their position of neutrality and be part of the kind of division of the world into the Cold War opponents that was currently going on. And India's always had a relatively warm relationship with then the Soviet Union, and even now, to a certain extent, Russia. So, we were involved in it then, so at that point we were supporting Pakistan's demands on Kashmir. Then that shifted, and it mainly shifted during the Bush administration, and particularly after the Modi government was elected. Then the idea became that we were going to, bring them in this anti-Chinese thing. Well, what gets lost here? Kashmir. I mean, nobody. They just become a pawn on the board. I think the Obama administration recognized that there were some terrible injustices going on in Kashmir, but expediency said, we're not going to do anything about this. Now, the Indians have told everybody in the region, we're not going to talk to you about Kashmir. So China's not going to talk to them Kashmir. They've already got some tensions with the Indians. First of all, they fought a border war with India in the 60s, which the Indians lost. China currently occupies sections of the country that India considers Indian territory. Chinese claim that the Indians have occupied sections of the Himalayas, which China considers part of it thing. So the China's not going to get involved in this. The Russians have always kept kind of a hands off. The U.S. is not going to get involved in this. Afghanistan doesn't have much power. The fact is that there's no one who's really interested in Kashmir. And that's a terrible problem because it's such a dangerous situation. And I get a little strong. I mean, there are a lot of things in this world which scare me, but the one that really gets me up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat is the idea of some militant group pulling off an attack in India, India responding with cold start, some local Pakistani commander panics, lobs a tactical nuke at Indian military forces. The Indians respond with the strategic warhead, and all of a sudden, you and I are eating a lot less wheat than we're used to.
Yeah, and on that subject, before we wrap up, I want to turn our attention back to this idea of a nuclear winter, because as you've said, obviously this would affect people living in India and living in Pakistan and living in that region, and there would be horrible consequences in that region beyond probably anything we can imagine. But it would also affect those of us who don't live in that region. There would be issues with the food supply and with agriculture, increased radiation, all sorts of effects. What can you get into a little more of what those effects would be, and just what a nuclear winter would mean for all of us? Well,
a study was done at Rutgers and at the University of Colorado Boulder and the University of California, Los Angeles. And what they did was they figured out what would happen if you detonated 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Now, as I said before, Hiroshima-sized bombs are little tiny bombs, 15 kilotons. It's like nothing. If you detonated 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs in both countries, that it would generate between 1 and 5 million tons of smoke, that within 10 days would drive temperatures in the northern hemisphere down 4, 5, 6 degrees, as I said, too cold for wheat production in Canada and Russia. It would also affect rainfall. There would be a 10% drop in rainfall, particularly the Asian monsoon would be very deeply affected. It could quickly exhaust worldwide food supplies. And the study says potentially, besides the 20 million Pakistanis and Indians that would be killed by such a war, that it could lead to the starvation of up to 100 million people. Besides that, between 25 and 70% of the Northern Hemisphere's ozone layer would be destroyed. And I don't know if people remember this, but back when there was a large hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica, at that time, school children in New Zealand were required to wear long-sleeved shirts and dresses, to wear hats all the time, and when they ate lunch outside, when they went to school, they had to eat them under awnings because of the holes in the ozone layer and the fact that you could produce melanoma and skin cancers and all sorts of stuff. And that was a relatively small hole. I mean, it was up to, I think the highest was about 40%. But this could be up to 70% of the northern hemispheres. Ultraviolet radiation not only causes skin cancer, but it also has a big impact on plant life and particularly plankton. So you're suddenly talking about a cascade of things. Add to this climate change, and you're really beginning to look an awful lot like Armageddon. If you go back and say, take a look at the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, that dropped temperatures about 1 to 2 degrees worldwide, and had big effects on crops and all sorts of things. This would be 1,000 times bigger than that. This would be, 1 million Krakatoas. Which when Krakatoa went off, that's what they called the summer that never came. It was worldwide. There was essentially no summer, and this is, again, that would just be a little cloud of smoke compared to what these nuclear weapons would do. I tell people, nobody reads John Hershey's Hiroshima anymore. And I don't know, it should be required reading. I used to assign it in my journalism classes because it won a Pulitzer Prize for John Hersey. It ran as a 3-part series in the New Yorker originally. And that is really the only book in English, there are some in Japanese, the only book in English that talks about nuclear war and gives people an idea of what a nuclear weapon is. And what's quite obvious in reading it, because it's a lovely piece of literature, what's quite obvious is that what Hersey figured out very quickly was that this wasn't just a big bomb. This was a different plane of reality. This was something completely different. And what it did was completely different. And as I said, that was just a little bomb. Just a nuclear weapon with a bad temper. It is anything like the nuclear weapons today. And I think people don't read John Hersey. That happened more than 70 years ago, and our memory's dim. And it scares me.
No, it's very scary, and I briefly brought this up in my question there, and I didn't mean to downplay this, so I do want to ask you very quickly about the subject, but just how devastating would a nuclear war be for the people living in India and Pakistan and in that region, setting aside all of the nuclear winter concerns that we would have around the globe, just how the immediate concerns and fears of the people right there in that region, how devastating would this be?
It's almost hard to get your head around it. I mean, I've actually tried to do that, to think about exactly what would happen. Say, the Hiroshima bomb, as I said, was 15 kilotons, and it was an airburst because they were not certain that a warhead could survive impact with the ground. So they set it off at about 1,500 feet, parachuted it down, then set off. Airbursts tend to kill a lot of people, cause firestorms, but they don't produce a huge amount of radiation because they don't strike the ground and vaporize big sections of the ground, and that's of course all irradiated, and then that spreads all over the place. So while there was significant amount of radiation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this would be much worse because these would be ground strike, most of these. To give you an example, if you think of say the average size nuclear warhead in the American arsenal, which is anywhere from 100 to 250 kilotons. We have warheads that are up to 50 megatons. But that's like talking about a black hole. You can't get your head around it. If you have a weapon that 15 kilotons, it killed just about 100,000 people in a millisecond, and about another 100,000 in the weeks and months that followed from a combination of burns and radiation. So killed slightly in excess of 200,000 people, 15 kilotons, okay? So then you jump that up to 100 kilotons. And then you think of, for instance, dropping that on New Delhi or Mumbai. Or any of the large. I mean, Mumbai is a city of 22 million. 100 kiloton warhead dropped on Mumbai would probably kill instantly 4 to 5 million people. Within the weeks that followed, probably another 3 to 4 million people would die as a result of burns and medical difficulties and radiation, etc. But of course, that doesn't address the fact that you would also have these great, food shortages. The other thing to keep in mind is, where are hospitals? Hospitals are all in cities. I mean, that makes sense, right? That's where you've got your resources. It's where you have your transport systems, where you can exchange technology, instruments, medicines, etc. Well, cities are the targets of nuclear weapons. So not only do you produce this tremendous medical crisis, you destroy all of the ability to treat it. In Hiroshima, only one hospital survived from that bombing. And the descriptions that Hershey gives of what the corridors of that hospital look like should be required reading for everybody. So I would say that if both sides were lucky, we would initially kill about 10 million people on each side. But I would say that you could at least half again that amount in a month that would follow. And in the long run, given what happened with food shortages and that kind of stuff, you could probably triple the number that would die.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's staggering.
Yeah, it's amazing. So one final question for you, and it's a difficult question to answer, I suppose. You had a simple question, but do you have any predictions about this? What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, boy. First of all, I've kind of gotten out of the prediction business. I didn't think the Brexit was going to pass. It passed. I didn't think Trump was getting elected. He got elected. I don't think my predictability thing is very good. I will say this. About every 3 or 4 years, the U.S. Defense Department carries out a series of war games of a conventional war between India and Pakistan. Every single one ends in nuclear war. Now, I tend to be an optimist. I really am. First, I don't think there's any particular advantage of being a pessimist. I'm an optimist, and I would very much hope that this could be avoided. What concerns me is that there seems to be this lack of concern about it. Does Kashmir and Donald Trump, he probably thinks it's a sweater. I have no idea what this administration is going to do. I do think that I hope that there are sensible enough people on both sides that this is not going to happen. But It really scares me. Of all the things that scare me, this is the one that scares me the worst. I worry about the possibility of a nuclear war with Russia. Sure, that scares me. I worry about the possibility of a military conflict between China and the U.S., or maybe China and Japan with the U.S. coming into it. Yeah, that worries me too. But this is the one that scares me because I don't see anybody worrying about it. And if people think a nuclear war is a local question, they're in for a very, very unpleasant surprise.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining me today.
Sure.
If someone wants to learn more about the sorts of things we've been discussing, and if someone wants to follow your work in particular, what resources and readings and websites would you direct them to?
Well, I think one of the things that they could do is if they went to the column that I just talked about, my column, I have links to, all of my sources there. I think that there are a number of organizations who are deeply concerned about this. I'm blanking on names right off the top of my head, but if you went to say Foreign Policy in Focus and looked at their list of readings and everything on nuclear weapons and the problems of nuclear weapons and everything, there's really a lot of stuff out there. And I would also urge people to go back and look at real documents. I mean, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement is 4 pages long and written in absolutely simple, language. You can download it, and print it out. I always keep a copy of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement with me. It makes fantastic reading, and it also indicates exactly what we have done and what we haven't done. There's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of concern right now, particularly with the Trump administration coming in. And, people can look at, for instance, the National Nuclear Security Administration, which the Trump administration is just about to bounce most of those people out of it. And they have a lot of stuff on their website that makes for very, very good reading. There's an organization called Plowshares Fund that is very, very interesting. A guy by the name of Joseph, and I'm just going to spell this for people because I'm not even sure how I spell it, how you pronounce it myself. Cincione. He's a guy who has worked for decades on the question of nuclear weapons and the dangers of nuclear war, and nuclear safety, and et cetera. He's a common sense guy. He's a smart guy. If people will look him up, you can get his publications. You can plug yourself into Plowshares funds. This stuff is all out there. And as far as the Kashmir part goes, I think one of the things is that people have to start talking about it. I mean, I want to have some mainstream newspaper ask Donald Trump or the Secretary of State or whatever, ask them, what are we doing about Kashmir? Are you concerned about the possibility of a nuclear war given these new policy decisions by India, cold start, and battlefield nuclear weapon commands being given to frontline commanders? Does that concern you? What is the United States doing about it? What is the United Nations doing about it? I think if there's some, if there's a little bit of noise out there, maybe we'll get people, to really start looking at this. And I strongly urge people, pick up Hiroshima by John Hersey. It's nothing. It takes you 2 hours to read it. And it's lovely writing. And it will remind you of what it is nuclear weapons do and why, under no circumstances, should they ever be used.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. And I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/India-Pakistan. And that's going to be the place to go for links and resources related to this episode. So again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/India-Pakistan. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so that you can get all the episodes and not miss any. And Conn, thank you so much for joining me today. And
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, hopefully we've been able to create a little noise on this area and generate a little
noise. The more noise people can make, the better.
Yeah, so even if it's just a little bit, then that's a start. So hopefully we'll be able to draw some attention to this. And thank you so much. I look forward to speaking again.
Okay, my pleasure.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.